Hey guys, Ruy Lopez is clearly a very strong opening and something we are going to face in a big percentage of our games as black. So we should be very well prepared. There is this line we call Archangel Defense that is a really good system against Ruy Lopez. The main difference between Archangel in its modern variation and other popular lines against Ruy Lopez, like Closed Defense, is that the dark square's bishop is going to be developed outside the chain of pawns. This means that your bishop is more active and you're putting more pressure on white's center, which, by the way, is one of the main plans for black in basically all these defenses versus Ruy Lopez. Apparently, the name Archangel is because of a city in Russia, since several grandmasters in that area were the first ones to use this variation. Without further delay, let's get into Archangel Defense. So we have Archangel Defense on the board after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then Ruy Lopez, bishop b5. Here we will play a6, more free defense, bishop a4, knight goes to f6, white castles, and then this move b5. White needs to play bishop b3, and then we can play two different approaches in Archangel Defense. We can play bishop b7, and this is like the most classical way to play it. And there is this modern approach where we just develop the bishop to c5 and we delay a little the development of the light square's bishop over the fianchetto. And an important advantage with this modern variation is that the bishop could be developed over this diagonal. Against Archangel Defense, white can develop pieces basically as they want, but we cannot see all the lines, and that's not really going to be helpful. So it's going to be much more beneficial to understand the position and typical plans and ideas for the opening and middle game. So we're going to focus on two main systems white can try, and they are knight takes e5, trying to take advantage of the development of the bishop over c5. So in the next move they should be playing d4 with a fork, or a typical development for a Ruy Lopez opening as white, where they play c3, d4, and a4 in the next moves. So after knight takes e5, we need to capture the knight in the center, and white is playing the fork, d4. The best move for black here is bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and we protect the knight with a development move d6. Observe that in this position black is threatening a really nice trick. For example, if white plays something normal like bishop e3, we're gonna capture this bishop. We have this idea of c5 and c4 trapping the bishop on b3, so we can play this move, and after the queen goes back, then c4, and the bishop is trapped over b3. White should try f4, getting some space, also getting a tempo. And here we have some options. There is c5, and also there is this line I prefer, knight c6. We are attacking the queen, so white should try queen c3, again getting some tempo attacking our knight, and we can develop and defend. In the next moves we should castle as soon as possible. White still has some development problems over here, so we could say this middle game is more or less equal. There is this beautiful game where Castro was white, he played Ruy Lopez, and the super GM Michael Adams was playing as black, and they got into this line. White played knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d4, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and then d6. f4, as we mentioned, is the best move for white in this position, and we started knight c6. I said that was my favorite move, but actually in this game Michael Adams was a little more aggressive and he tried c5. At this point Castro played queen c3, the knight goes to g4, the knight goes to the king side, and then this typical idea for this line, e5. The idea of this move is that as black king is still in the center, they are trying to open some lines, and for example if there is a trade here, the rook and the bishop can create some problems there on f7. So of course we are not going to trade at this point. Michael Adams played here knight e4, and after queen f3 d5. So the idea is that we keep the files as blocked as possible, as our king is still in the center. And we're still threatening this move, trapping the bishop, and that's why white played here c4. I want to mention this line: if white tries something more normal like c3, they could be in trouble. Black can play c4 now, and there is that they're opening this diagonal. So with the queen and the two knights, they can create many problems for that king. For example, let's say the bishop goes back. Well, we have queen b6 check, and when the king goes to the corner, that's the only move we have check, and they will have to lose a lot of material over there. If they try not to lose material like king u1, well, then we will have some smothered mate here with knight h3, queen u1, and knight f2, and then of course knight takes f2 again. So that's why in this position he's playing c4 instead, and Michael Adams takes the pawn, b takes c4. Actually, this move is not the best in the position. There is this line where we can capture the pawn on h2, and the idea is that we are playing the next moves queen h4, bishop g4, and knight g3. So we will have a lot of pieces over there, and the attack could be very dangerous. So for example, king takes knight, queen h4, king u1, bishop g4, and after queen e3, knight g3. We are threatening some things, queen h1 maybe, also knight takes rook, of course. So there are some ideas. After rook e1, d4 is probably a good move. Queen d3, we can castle, and after a development move like knight d2, well, probably there is a draw by repetition here. We can play bishop f5 and then bishop g4. Observe that in this position the queen should not get away from the king, because there might be a very strong attack with the three pieces on the king side. Also, we are playing d3, controlling even more squares over there, and the attack is going to be too much. Instead of that, Adams took the pawn on c4, and then bishop a4 is going to be very well. Here, black shouldn't block, because the knight is going to be hanging over here. So if we try this, queen takes knight, we can still get the bishop back, but then queen takes g7. This position is very good for white. So that's why after bishop a4, Adams just played king f8. This is not so bad, because he's planning to put the king safe over here and activate the rook over the h file by playing, for example, the move h5, and also moving the rook over the third rank. So after king f8, bishop c6, rook b8, knight c3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, and then d4. So now he's advancing the pawn majority in the center, and probably he's going to create a passed protected pawn over there, which is going to create some problems for white. Bishop a3, king g8, moving the king away from that diagonal. Bishop takes c5, and then d3. Now the pawn is on the 6th rank. Rook a b1, there is a trade on that open file, and h5. The same idea we were saying. Now the rook is lifting, the knight is very well protected, the pawn is also advancing in some positions. Queen e4, rook h6, and at this point there is the final mistake here. White played a blunder in this position, and it is this move, bishop d6. The problem is that this bishop was covering f2 very well, so after this move Michael can try queen h4, and now he's threatening two things, queen h2 or queen f2. So this position is totally lost for white. After a3 he played queen f2 and queen takes a2, and now there is a double threat, the rook and the fork. In the game, well, white played rook b8, and then queen a1 is just winning because the king cannot escape over here. But also I want to mention, for example, a line like rook f1, we can play knight f2 and then queen takes f2, and this position is totally lost for white. Observe, we are playing rook g6, we have a lot of attack over here, but also there is a pawn on the 6th rank promoting, so this is decisive advantage for black. The other line is when white tries c3, d4, and a4, as it is very typical in Ruy Lopez. So c3, in this position white is threatening d4, and when white plays d4 we don't want to trade, because then we are going to lose our center and white will have two central pawns. So we need to play d6 here. So after d4 we can just move our bishop back, and our pawn in the center is very well protected. So d4, we continue bishop b6, a4, and this is a very common move in Ruy Lopez. The idea is that they're attacking our advanced pawns on the queen side. For example, if we trade here, we will have an isolated pawn on a6, very weak. But also if we don't trade, they will, and then we will have a weak pawn over here. It's going to be very easy to attack that pawn on b5. Moves like knight a3, queen d3 are very normal, and sometimes it's a little annoying, the pressure on that pawn. That's why this move is important in these positions. And also white is taking here, and there is a pin, so our rook is hanging over there, so we need to be careful with this idea. Here there are three main options for black. We can play rook b8. This is the main line in this position, but also bishop b7 is very normal. The rook is protected, and probably my favorite option is going to be just bishop g4. We are pinning the knight, but also the knight is a good defender of the center, so once we are pinning, the pressure in the center is just much more. So this is my favorite line in this position. The game can continue, for example, like a takes b5, a takes b5, rook a8, and then queen takes a8. And one more time, this position is more or less equal. For the next moves, we are planning to castle and also to continue with a big pressure on white's center. I found this impressive game where Ruy Fan was playing as white and Adams as black, and they played this variation. So c3, d6, d4, bishop b6, and a4. Adams played this time the main line with rook b8, knight a3. White starts the pressure on that pawn after castling. A takes b5, a takes b5, and knight takes b5. Observe that this time we are losing the pawn on b5, but this is something we are gonna do very often in Archangel Variation. The idea is that we're getting a half open file over here, but also notice there are white pieces hanging over the b file. This bishop is protected by the queen, but also the queen needs to keep the protection of the knight on f3 and the pawn on d4. So when we play bishop g4, and that's what Michael Adams played here, there is a really good compensation for that pawn on b5. The pressure is so much that white needed to play d5 here, but this is actually fine for black. In general, when white blocks, they are blocking the bishop, and our bishop is much better, so this is not a problem. Knight e7 is a normal move, bishop c2, and then queen e8 is attacking the unprotected knight on b5, c4 protecting that knight. And here there is a move I want you to observe very seriously. It's a typical tactics we have in this line, and it is this move, knight takes e4. The idea of this sacrifice is that we are getting the piece back here in the pin, because in the next two moves we are playing f5 and e4. So the game continued. Bishop takes e4, f5, bishop d3, and e4. Bishop e2, pawn takes f3, bishop takes f3, and then this move, knight g6. White played b3. Notice the capture of the pawn here on g4 is actually a bad idea. So bishop takes g4, f takes g4, and queen takes g4. Black is winning with a nice tactics here, and it is this move, rook takes f2, and if white recaptures, we have queen e1, checkmate. So that's the reason why G-Fan played here b3, and the game continued knight h4. Michael brings more pieces to the king side. Bishop takes g4, f takes g4, and then bishop g5. Queen h5 looks normal, is defending, is also attacking. Bishop takes h4, trying to simplify a little the position, especially on the king side. Queen takes h4, and observe the pressure here on f2 is a big pressure over there. However, white found rook a2 defending over the second rank. Then rook f6, bringing reinforcements over the f file. Queen d3, rook f8, and queen g3. Of course, we don't want to trade pieces in a position like this. We want to keep our queens on the board, and we want to keep the pressure. So queen h6, queen d3, and here this idea really interesting, g3. white can capture with two pieces, the h-pawn and the queen, but in both cases black is going to have a really nice position. For example, if white takes here with the queen, now the queen is not on this ring, now the queen is not blocking on f1, so here we can play rook takes f2, and if white recaptures, we recapture, and they cannot recapture with the rook because we have queen c1. As I said, the queen is not here to block, so that's why the capture with the queen on g3 is not really a very good idea. So after g3, white just took with the h-pawn, but the compensation here is the h file. Now it is going to be open, so we can try this idea, queen h5, wanting to play rook h6 with a forced mate over there. So Ruy Fan played queen e2, and then there is a tactic move at this point. Now the queen is blocking the rook over the second rank, so we have this idea, rook takes f2. And in the game, queen takes queen, but if the rook takes on f2, we can just capture here with the bishop. And well, if the king moves, we have made queen h1. And if the queen takes, we can just take the queen, the rook takes the rook, and then check, and we capture the pawn on b3. This position is still complicated. It's probably a long endgame, but black is clearly better. Black has a queen versus a rook and a knight. In the game, after rook takes f2, white just played queen takes h5, and here we want to get that queen back. So Adams played rook f5, discovered check. The king cannot go over here because we could have checkmate, so white needs to block, and then the rook is going to be pinned. So rook f2 was played, rook takes h5, g4, rook h6, wanted to play rook f6 very soon, b4, rook f2, rook f2, bishop e3 first, just to make sure white is not playing some c5 and getting rid of the pin, knight c3, rook f6 now, knight d1, defending and attacking, bishop takes f2, knight takes f2, and rook a4. This is an endgame with the exchange up, but black is capturing some pawns on the queen side, so the advantage is decisive, and that's why Ruy Fan resigned at this point. As I am a big fan of Archangel Variation, I have played it in official tournaments, and this is probably my best victory in this line. My opponent played the line with c3 and d4 later, so c3, d6, d4, and bishop b6. Here a4 as we said, and also bishop g4 as I mentioned in the analysis. a3 was played, bishop h5, and now this move, bishop g5. This move is actually very tricky, and I want to take advantage of the position to highlight some ideas. The bishop is not on c8, so we are not ready to defend our knight on c6. So here there is a threat. There's another pin over here, so the knight is not defending d5. So the threat here is bishop d5, and this pin is actually a big problem for this kind of situations. White could be getting material advantage here. That's why I played here rook b8, moving the rook away from this diagonal, but also away from this file. In some positions, white can also play bishop takes knight, and then if I recapture with the queen, the rook could be unprotected on a8, so there could be a pin, and they could be capturing b5. So rook b8 looks like a move I need to play here. A takes b5, a takes b5, and then g4. This move is aggressive but also very risky. Bishop g6, bishop d5 now, and then knight e7. Something we need to keep in mind when we play Archangel defense is that in many positions we need to be willing to lose one pawn for compensation, and that's what I'm doing here in this game. Very often it's the pawn on b5, and sometimes it could be the pawn on e5. The main idea is that as white loses some tempi trying to get that pawn and they misplace some of their pieces, we're going to be developing, improving, and taking advantage of the new open lines. In the game, my opponent played d takes e5. I took his bishop on d5, so now I have the two bishops on an open position, e takes d5, d takes e5, and he played bishop takes e7. I want to mention this line: if knight takes e5, I can just play here f6 with a fork. If they try to save the piece by playing knight takes g6, well, I'm fine here. I just take with h, and I'm threatening the bishop and the pawn on h3 at the same time. So this position is actually very well for black. That's why he played bishop takes e7. He wanted to get one of these pawns with this idea. After queen takes e7, there is queen e2. There is a double attack on these pawns. Observe, my king could be in check if they capture b5, but as we mentioned, if we play Archangel, we are willing to lose one pawn for compensation, and that's why I said, okay, I will lose the pawn on e5, but I think the compensation is clear. So I just castled here, and after queen takes e5, let's analyze a little the position here. We have the two bishops in an open position, as my opponent has two knights, so this should be already enough compensation for the pawn down. But also when we analyze the king's safety, we can see that this king is not fine here. He advanced the pawns on the king side too much, and when the center is blocked, this is probably fine, but in this position so open, this is going to be a problem. So I just played here queen d7, avoiding trades, especially thinking of white king, rook d1, and then we improve the rook and we get a tempo, rook e8, the queen goes to g5, and then this move f5. As we have rooks and we have bishops, we need to open lines, and these pawns are a weakness, so I'm just trying to use that weakness as a hook to open more lines. Knight d4, f takes g4, h takes g4, and in the next move we are going to attack weaknesses. So there is this pawn on g4, we can play rook e4, and well, here white is lost. In the game, knight f5, but this is not going to solve the problem. After bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes f5, we're attacking the queen, and we are attacking f2. He played rook a8 check, but this doesn't change anything, just king f7, and white resigned. For example, if they try something like queen e2 here, well, we can just capture bishop f2 check, and well, if the king goes to h, we have check on h4. If the king goes to f, we have this covered, bishop c5, and well, I think this is going to be made very soon. If you guys have any question, let me know in the comments. If you want to learn a really strong line as white, check out this interesting video about Queen's Gambit. I'm sure you will enjoy it, and it will help you a lot. Thank you so much, guys. Like, subscribe, see you on the next.